I'm going to ask you to welcome my friend Dr. Amy Abernethy, who's a tenured associate professor in the Duke University Schools of Medicine and Nursing, director of the Duke Cancer Care Research Program, and a medical oncologist and palliative medicine physician. Her credentials for this afternoon are extraordinary. I can't resist reading some of them. She's a member of the advisory committee for the Turning of the Tide conference, and one of the many members of that committee who said the conference can't end at the end of the day. We have to keep on, so we better be pretty sure we know what the path forward is. She's internationally recognized for her work in improving delivery of patient-centered cancer care. She's an appointee to the Institute of Medicine's National Cancer Policy Forum. She's president-elect of American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine. She's on the board of the PMC. She's on the advisory board for the Rapid Learning System for Cancer for the American Society of Clinical Oncology, and she's co-chair of the National Institutes of Health-Funded Palliative Care Research Cooperative Group. So she has been tracking today's entire discussion, and it's now up to her to encapsulate the key points and summarize the important next steps. Amy.
Okay, so if that's not a scary call to action job, here we go. So for those of you who've seen me scribbling furiously over the course of today, what I've been trying to do is think about what were some of the core messages and then the meta messages that will help us get from here to there. We heard from both John Mendelsohn as well as Dr. Mukherjee that we're in an extraordinary place in cancer care, that we've seen historic and remarkable scientific progress, and this is leading to progressive knowledge and refinement of what it is that we know. We went from disfiguring surgeries to chemotherapy, where we were so impressed by a temporary remission, to chemotherapy that can cure, for example, diseases like testicular cancer, to progressive refinement and understanding of cancer biology that's led to omics technologies and molecular understanding. We're in the age of targeted therapy. And we also have a clinical and a financial imperative. There's the clinical urgency of cancer. There's also the rising cost of healthcare. And we see that we're likely shifting from cancer as a fatal disease to cancer as a chronic disease, and we're going to have to think about how we deal with that together with our patients. This is a slide that I've borrowed from Charles Hugh Jones that reminds us that while we've seen remarkable innovation in other areas, what we now need to see is the same kind of improvements in disease outcomes for people with cancer. Cardiology has gone down remarkably. Cancer, we've seen some improvement, but we've got a long way to go. Let's harness what's happening in our sciences. This is a figure really to remind me, in figure form, where we are. So we used to think about a specific disease bucket: breast cancer, lung cancer, colorectal cancer, other cancers. And in each disease bucket, we went through the basic sciences, we had the clinical trials, we applied the evidence. And so I knew how to take care of metastatic breast cancer, and I knew how to think about first-line care. And then we started adding biomarkers, and we had biomarkers by disease bucket. And then we started to combine all of our disease buckets together to create the concept of having cancer, and cancer aligned by biomarker. So as we think about imatinib for CML, GIST, and other diseases, we're starting to think across cancers and not just within any one disease bucket. And then we start to overlay other patient characteristics, personal values. The complexity of all of the different substratification is going bing, 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 to the sense that you kind of stand there and wonder. But right now, we may be wondering about what therapies to give our patients, but think about what that feels like standing from the point of view of the patient. And we're all people, and ultimately will be patients who encounter the healthcare system at one point or another, hopefully not with cancer, but maybe so. Patients live lives. They see a longitudinal outlook, and what they do is they live across time. We used to talk about adjuvant or first-line metastatic therapy, and now we're thinking about neoadjuvant, adjuvant, first-line, second-line, third-line, nth-line therapy. And as we think about cancer becoming a chronic disease and all the complexity of innovation, that complexity is now not only across one point in time, but it's longitudinal, as Mark McClellan was pointing out. So we've got complexity overlined by time, and what we see is a massive Rubik's Cube of information coming along in the context of cancer. And that Rubik's Cube of information really has as a fundamental substrate, as we've heard over and over today, data and science. That's how we get to knowledge. But as Anna reminded us, data is not knowledge. We've got to get from data to the knowledge. And then also for people with cancer, what we heard today was that access wasn't just in Houston or New York City or Durham, North Carolina. Access was wherever you were in the nation. And so we've got to remember that as we go through the Rubik's Cube and we move from data to knowledge, we've got to make sure that we provide that access as well as we involve patients from every spot that we're supposed to touch. And so in fact, we need to remember about personalization in the context of cancer care, that we need to use our innovation to take care of individual patients. That gets us to patients at the center. So as we think about the remarkable scientific progress that John and Dr. Mukherjee pointed out in the clinical and financial imperative, we see other transformations in oncology. We've gone from trials designed for populations to the context of having science matched to the individual level and needing to think about trials designed for individuals and how we work through that. And we need a vision for sustained innovation. So let's learn from some examples. Our first session, our first panel really, started to help us think about what examples might already be in front of us. I think it was Lee Newcomer who reminded us that the idea of charisma and vision, showing us what it might look like, is so important. Because once we can understand what innovation might look like, we can then all start to jump on and collaborate and be a part of the bandwagon. We heard about, for example, I-SPY 2 and Laura Esserman and the adaptive clinical trials approaches. We also heard about Battle when Dr. Mendelsohn was talking. And one of the things that Laura reminded us was that organizational efficiency needed to become the norm, that we had to think about how do we optimally connect the discovery sciences and the clinical trial system, and it takes vision, commitment, coordination across stakeholders, and it has to be collaborative by design. Build into the organization collaboration and show what that looks like. Kathy Gusti reminded us the importance of what happens when motivated individuals with good business sense and an idea of how to do this differently and turn the system on its head can actually really remarkably innovate in science. And it doesn't have to happen just in big diseases like breast cancer, but it actually can happen in chordoma and myeloma and across all of the different diseases, because when we really get down to it, what John Mendelsohn's lecture reminded us is that they're all going to be rare cancers going forward. So for a decade, Kathy said, everyone had these pretty slides that talked about the patient at the center, but we really weren't at the center, she said. Now, as patients, we know which organizations or academic centers are doing the beautiful work, and then we go back to them. Once they've demonstrated that they can do the best science, we go back to them over and over again. So put the model on its head and have patients go and find, together with people who know how to evaluate the science, who's doing exceptional science. And that also we need trusted brokers, creative partnerships, and business savvy. Lynn Lichtenfeld reminded us about the importance of funding and advocacy. It's a big world out there, he said, and we cannot get to the front door. We've got to realize that patients are in the community. IT is critical, and we've got to make investments in junior investigators. And by the way, we can't get patients, people who can't get through the front door. It's really important to remember that people are everywhere. And then there are industry innovators, like going on in Novartis, where Christy Shaw told us we're in a place now where we have to bring the whole disease to the market. Drug, biomarker, access programs, and solutions around the patient. It's a system. Bring the protocol to the patient and think about how each patient should have access to novel approaches. Another panel asked, how do we define value? Gwyndarian reminded us that value is in the eye of the beholder, and we've got to determine what parameters might be there. And Bill Dalton said we really need to identify need and develop a means to meet those needs and develop a system to predict it before it manifests, including diverse aspects such as biologic predictors, psychological predictors, value, and judgment. But Al Benson then followed on to say, there is an inherent tension in that, though. We need to understand the concept of value at the patient level, but as a society, we've got to figure out value at the society level. Lee Newcomer went on to say, as a payer, we have to set value equations that apply across a population, and then the person has to apply their personal values underneath that. And there needs to be a society-wide discussion so we can figure out how to move forward. And finally, Richard Gaynor told us that there's meaningful increases in survival, and that's what we need to strive for. But remember that it's not just survival, but it's quality survival and improved clinical benefit. So the other part that we heard in the value discussion and came out over and over is that we need evidence to inform value. Therefore, we need to link the data with the evidence development process and cycle with the value that's coming out. We need to think broadly about innovation. Mark McClellan spoke about this, telling us we're going to get an era of more and more personalized medicine, but the real question is how long it'll take, what will require of us, and what we're going to need to give up to get there. He did point out that there is a high average value of increasing healthcare costs. One of the reasons it's so hard to have the suggestion that we might not be able to have everything is because, indeed, we've seen that as healthcare gets more innovative and moves forward, there has been evidence that that healthcare has been better for us. There has been a track record within the agencies of starting to learn how to innovate and move forward, and we need to keep pushing that track record. And we need innovation to make sure that we're doing the right research. For example, pre-competitive innovation and post-regulatory real-world data acquisition, application of predictive tools to evidence development, data harmonization, and agreement on what success means. Over and over again, that message of data, measurement, evidence came through, including the longitudinality of the data and making sure that it's replicable, and that we needed to think about reform in the provider and payment space. So what were some of the meta themes that I took out of this, and how does that move us to the last panel? Those meta themes really are the themes that I call the call to action in response to where we are in that complexity, that excitement around the movement in improving the cancer sciences, and the clinical and health system urgency. The first thing I did was sit down and scratch my head around the concept of innovation. This is an innovation conference, and we're talking about innovation. Have we actually said today, what is innovation and what does it mean? And so Wikipedia, since I was sitting in the back, innovation is the creation of better or more effective products, processes, services, technology, or ideas that are readily available to markets, governments, and society. Whereas invention is the creation of new methods and new ideas, innovation is moving creation into application. It's bringing action. And improvement is doing the same things better. So we do want to improve, but really what we want to do in our cancer space is innovate. Within the engineering sciences, there's an argument that innovation only really requires three things. Need, I think we can agree that we've got it. Competent people with the relevant technology. We really have motivated individuals at the patient side, the researcher side, the government side, the business side, the industry side. Now we need to figure out how to put them all together and keep our technologies getting smarter and smarter. And finally, financial support. We've heard clearly today that the business case matters. There should be the process of diffusion of innovations, but we need to make sure that diffusion doesn't take 7 or 15 years, but rather we can move from key innovations in our scientific centers, getting to patients where they are, and technology can make that happen. Somebody reminded me today in one of the breaks, he said, my sister who was sick, she went first to Houston, then she went to New York, then when she went to Rochester, And so I turned around and said to her, you know what? You can get an IV wherever you are, Oklahoma, North Carolina, Kansas, Hawaii, Puerto Rico. And in fact, we've got to get our innovations to people where they are. And then finally, we can have both disruptive innovation, completely new technologies. So for example, deep sequencing or other omics applications. But we can also have incremental innovation, keep building on what we're learning best. So the core observation there is that science and healthcare environment today for cancer is poised to support innovation. And I think that was one of the meta messages we heard. The second was that the whole community is responsible for aligning the systems to get where the biology is heading. It's a push and a pull, and we should do that together. And so the core meta message was to align incentives among the stakeholders through partnership. But there is also a central incentive. There is a patient at the center of the process and fundamentally the basic elements of an N of one. We ultimately take care of individuals. And so let's put the patient at the center. And there's the complexity of data and data for personalization, but also data is our fundamental substrate. But there's more complexity. There's complexity of science and computational biology. There's complexity of the healthcare system. And so what we need to remember is that we have to embrace complexity. Don't make anything more complex than it needs to be, but get comfortable with the fact that sometimes it's not always that simple. We need a cycle of learning with the patient in the process, in the center. And so together we innovate, plan, do, study, act, and educate around the patient. We need to align the business case because that's how we define value and make sure that we do innovate. It's one of the core tenets. There is urgency and time is running out. So we need to make sure that we work on getting answers, getting data, and reforming healthcare. I think it was, again, Lee Newcomer who reminded us that we need to move from being, I think what he said was computational chemists to organic chemists when possible to make sure that we deal with the real-time urgency. In terms of getting there, we heard a sequence. So there was a sequence of science and education, of making sure that there were patients, and patients at the center of what we did. The patients helped us generate data at all levels of the system, and that we learned how to use that data through a series of use cases, exemplars, so that we understood what innovation looked like and then could learn through a series of use cases how to get better and better. And that there were partners. We talked about creative partnerships with trusted brokers and collaboration among multi-stakeholders. The partnerships themselves were responsible for leading to the tipping point, and that then everything could move towards the same direction. And again, I go back to that idea that we have to see what the vision looks like, and that was one of the points of today's conference. And then the others, that the altruism and motivation of patients should be part of the pull as well as part of the push. That we need to align with the patient in the process because fundamentally they are us. So that we ultimately have to align policies with the incentives with the process. The last session then helped us start to think about what policies might need to be in place in order to move towards sustainable innovation in cancer. What do we need to get there? So Rick Pazner reminded us that a greater understanding of the disease, that ultimately the major issue is still efficacy, and that we need to understand the disease to get there, so we've got to align the science. David Parkinson said we must invest in the molecular diagnostics and strategies to work through this, and we need a business case. It was a reminder that we need business models. John Castellani told us there are a lot of drugs are out there and available and in development, and we need to absolutely figure out how we use them. Ken Anderson reminded us that we need team science working together and focused on the patient, but again, make sure we get the science. And Ira Klein said we need decision tools. We need to figure out how to move today's innovation into action for the particular patient. And there has to be a reward system for all participants. Some of the other things that we heard in that last session on a potential path forward including reshaping the evidence development process, national standards for doing the science, innovation in clinical trials, and innovation in statistical and analytic approaches. That it's about the data, and we need solutions to allow data collection and use across all care settings, but data isn't knowledge. That it isn't that we have a paucity of data, but we have to instead know how to use the data that we have and generate new and meaningful and replicable data in the future. And we must learn how to share among each other and learn from the data that we have together. There has to be a business case, a new workforce that rewards team science, and I remind myself that the investigators of the future also have a new way of thinking about data, and we ought to harness that opportunity for us right now. And we need to develop solutions to improve patient outcomes, involving patients in the solution, defining and achieving value, and ensuring access. These were some ideas of things that I had in mind that might come out of panel 3, and as a highlight, a few additional things to point out was aligning comparative effectiveness research and health technology assessment with the patient and the science so that it's a complete cycle enabled through policy. So in final closing, as a part of our call to action, we're at a tipping point. We need to redefine what is cancer and continue that redefinition process and make sure that the science continues. We need to personalize therapy. We need to maintain healthcare sustainability. We need to get the data and use it. We need to create creative partnerships, and we need to make sure that the policy moves forward. I'm going to read from my notes the last 5 policy solutions that were highlighted by the last panel, because I think it's important that we remember that it isn't all meta level all the time, that as we say we need policy solutions and we need a way forward, we actually have practical steps coming out of our audience. For example, we were reminded we need to build a national biorepository and standards into the way we do our science, especially federally funded science. We need to coordinate leadership across our agencies is one of the things that Rick Pazder reminded us. We need to create a reward system for highly predictive clinical tests. We need a societal debate about what we're going to pay for. We need to change the Medicare reward system. And then finally, Ken Anderson reminded us that we need to fund new discovery. At the end of the day, we still need new discovery, and also we need to make sure that our laboratories are doing the new discovery to teach the workforce of tomorrow. So as the part of call to action, think about what your role is in the process of sustainability and sustainable innovation in cancer. How are you going to create the environment necessary, and how are you going to be a part of the solution? Collaborate. Figure out what you can do to break down barriers and walls around you, or also to permeate and penetrate to partners that you see across the aisle. And finally, watch for new information coming out from this conference, as well as partnerships that have arisen from this conference, because that's our call for the future. So thank you.